with how policing, detention, the carceral state is all entangled. So I think, I want to make sure that we sort of acknowledge that, there are so many folks probably on this very event who are possibly, oh, sorry. Apparently the live stream is not working according to someone in my household. So if anyone can try that and see how it's going. But, I think it's, this is sort of a gathering of really like wonderful folks who've been working on this issue, but there's definitely other organizations and people that we would love to hear from. So just encourage folks to share that. And let me make sure. Okay, yeah. And then I guess, the other piece of folks who've been organizing kind of in this abolitionist framework for a long time, that, obviously immigrant organizers have been pushing against the expansion of immigration customs enforcement, right? This kind of terror regime enforced by ICE, as well as the horrific expansion of detention under the Obama administration and, going even before that. So, this sort of brings together, I think, a lot of different threads that are really important to talk about. Okay. So let me just reiterate that this is hosted by Planners Network, and thank you to Concordia University for providing the Zoom webinar. This is a roundtable, so we'll devote the last 30 minutes starting at 8:45 p.m. Eastern to audience questions. So please put those in the Q&A as you think of them, and share in the chat any thoughts you have. Brief introduction of the panelists, and then we'll begin. So this is, I think, all-star team of really amazing folks, and we're lucky to have Sheryl-Ann Simpson, who's an assistant professor of geography and environmental studies at Carleton University, and also one of the co-editors of the special issue on planning beyond mass incarceration, which was just published in June 2002. Let's see if I can get that image up. For JPER, Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. Deshonay Dozier is an assistant professor of human geography at Cal State Long Beach and is a member of the Progressive City editorial collective, and is writing a book right now that I'd love to hear more about on how poor people kind of practice abolition within their own lives by planning for a better Los Angeles. Courtney Knapp teaches at Pratt in Brooklyn, New York, and in this special issue of JPER, published an article that was based on research she conducted, a nationwide survey of planning directors that really was trying to figure out how does local planning, or how does it not, engage with formerly incarcerated people, so-called prisoner reentry, and where are the opportunities for planning to actually step up and do something. And then Silky Shah, who is the executive director of Detention Watch Network, which is a national coalition working to abolish immigration detention in the US. She's also a contributor to the Transformative Planning book, which was just published last year in the chapter titled Immigration Policy and Planning in the Era of Mass Incarceration. So with that, let me start with the first question, and I maybe just will toss this to Sheryl-Ann first, which is the kind of, what does the carceral state mean? I mean, we made this title Confronting the Carceral State. So what is the carceral state, or the prison industrial complex, which was, I think, the concept that I was first acquainted with, and what is abolition, and kind of what role does planning have? Like, how does it fit into this? So I'll toss it to Sheryl-Ann first, but I'd love to hear from everybody on the panel.
Versus, of course, you'll toss it to me first. So first, I just want to say thanks a huge amount for organizing this and for everybody that is spending time with us. I know that we are all spending a lot of time on Zoom right now, so it feels really special that folks are taking the time to spend some of their Zoom time with us to have this conversation. I'll start backwards. I think the question of like what abolition is to me, in some ways it's really simple. I think it's the idea of removing and sort of refusing resources to systems that harm. So systems of surveillance, systems of incarceration, systems of banishment, right? So sort of removing resources from those systems and putting them into systems of care. And at base, I think that's what abolition is. And I think those resources can be financial, but they're also about our time. They're also about our imaginations, right? So that refusal of putting our imagination, that refusal of putting our time into these systems of harm, and putting our imagination and putting our time into systems of care. I think at base, that's sort of what I think about when I think about abolition. And I think the name is really important. I think phrases like defund the police, I think are really, they're good rallying cries, but the name abolition I think is really important because it ties directly to the abolition movement against chattel slavery. And so I think by using that term abolition, I think part of what folks were doing was really intentional, which was linking directly sort of current systems of incarceration, current systems of harm back to that, at least, especially in an American case, but in other places as well, linking it back to that idea of chattel slavery and the idea that there's a direct link, right, from systems of chattel slavery into the system of, the prison industrial complex that we have right now. And those links are about, capitalism, they're about racial capitalism, and they're about colonialism. So, I think those links remain. And then I think just quickly in terms of planning, I think that for better or for worse, the connections are kind of all over it. Planning has played a huge part in, planning has played and continues to play a huge part in maintaining, capitalism, racial capitalism, and colonialism, right? And in the introduction to the special issue, one of my co-editors, we all kind of broke up the different bits that we wrote, and Justin Steele, one of the co-editors, was the one that kind of went through that history. In the essay, we go through a little bit of a history of zoning laws in the U.S. and how they started in, how some of them started in Baltimore, and it was really sort of this reaction the neighborhood had because a Black professional couple had moved into their neighborhood. And so an entire system was built around this idea of keeping these people out of the neighborhood. With such precision, one of the interesting details that Justin wrote about is the idea that Black folks were banned from living in these neighborhoods with the exception of domestics. So if somebody was living in this neighborhood because they were taking care of your baby or they were cleaning your house, they could be there. And just the idea that that was written into it, again, really speaks to the tie, back to chattel slavery, that speaks to the tie to capitalism, to racial capitalism, to colonialism, that, is sort of that tether. So I'll stop there.
Other folks on taking a stab at defining abolition or the carceral state?
Okay, I'll jump in, unless Courtney, you want to. Okay, I can jump.
Please, yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on this. I always, it's been really wonderful to be in this space with folks who are thinking about planning, because I think in so many ways the work that we do at Detention Watch Network and trying to get back the expansion of immigration detention actually is so related to planning, but we don't talk about it in that way. So it's been just a really incredible experience for me to kind of think about things in that way, and then think about what are the strategies we have given that what we know about planning. And so for me, I think abolition, in the context of immigration and working on immigration detention, when you look at the detention system, there's sort of two reasons that we choose to abolish detention. One is that it's a part of the sort of fabric of the prison industrial complex in the US. It's, an expanding space where you see more and more people being targeted both in the context of ICE, but also in the context of a lot of other agencies in the US that incarcerate immigrants for being immigrants specifically. But beyond that, it's also one of the key drivers of deportation. So the ability for ICE and the US government to deport people is their ability to have the space of detention to hold them for that deportation. And so to Sheryl-Ann's point, there's no question that a lot of this is about exclusion and banishment, or, you know, when you think about sort of the consequences that people face for choosing to migrate, or not just choosing to migrate, but choosing to migrate and then maybe, you know, committing an act that might be considered a crime, and then sort of the consequence of not just being punished by the criminal justice system or the criminal punishment system in the US, but also then the immigration system in the US, and then being deported out of the system and then sort of negotiating whatever happens on the other side. There's just so many layers. And to me, when, you know, abolish ICE became sort of the rallying cry for the sort of left of the movement, I think a lot of that was just, you know, I think a lot of people were fearful and saying, well, that's just open borders and that's so scary. And people really have no idea what ICE does in so many ways. But I think it was largely that feeling of, hey, this is about people being taken away from me. And for us working on the issue of immigration detention, it was really hard to talk about detention because it was such a invisible space where people went and people didn't know where they were, but what they felt was the deportation. They felt people being taken away from them. So I think in the context of abolition broadly, in the immigration context, it's sort of layered in all these spaces, and not just that, its relationship really to the criminal punishment system in the US. And then in terms of planning, you know, one of the biggest things we tackle so much on trying to abolish the immigration detention system is this dependency, the industrial complex aspect of this, right? Like this dependency on federal dollars for all these communities, is rural communities often that don't have the resources to care for themselves or think about what investments they make. And then now they're in this sort of game of just trying to get federal contracts to hold people. So not even about the privatization piece, but really about communities being impacted because of planning that's happened and where that's gone. So, yeah.
I would maybe just add a couple of, I mean, it's hard to follow both of you, really amazing. I mean, I think you both did great jobs of kind of capturing it. For me, I guess what I would add to the conversation is coming into this with a background in housing and economic development planning, I'm as interested in the sort of the history of police and the police state and the violent kind of enactments as I am the more benign ways in which inequalities and exclusions get perpetuated, and particularly how they like acutely, you know, affect people who have gotten caught up in the criminal justice system. So for me, I'm like thinking, you know, to Sheryl-Ann's point, you know, zoning, right, is like sort of this benign thing, yet it's got this police power, and therefore, but nevertheless, you know, we have an entire industry, you know, field, you know, kind of movement, which is planning, which has kind of, I think, defaulted to, you know, to assuming a more bureaucratic administrative role in communities at the expense of folks who are being damaged by those processes. And so for me, I'm interested in those more benign, kind of insidious ways that this stuff happens, and abolition, in kind of contrast to that. For me, abolition, you know, going back to echo Sheryl-Ann's point, it's rooted in this legacy of action, of resistance, of demanding something different, and seizing you know, the terms of that, you know, new model. And so me as a planner, but also as a planning academic who teaches and educates people who are going to go out to be part of this field, I am interested in like thinking about how do we organize actions and and alternatives both within and against this more, benign, sort of neutral version of cities, which I think all I have to do is scratch beneath the surface. The writing is all over the wall in how planning is implicated in these issues. And so I'm really interested in that aspect of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm appreciating this conversation so far. And I just want to add that for me, abolition means abolishing the conditions, right? Going back to what Sheryl-Ann said about abolishing the conditions of, or what would lead to the carceral state. And so for me, it means placing planning in a position of sort of not as a professional entity or an entity of expertise, right? But actually thinking about histories of resistance as planning, which is a field in planning research, and ultimately engaging with how these practices do shape and reshape the urban in many ways. And one of my mentors, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, writes about how the carceral state develops in California. And most of in which this happens is the organization of resources along with the initiation for organizing prisons for labor purposes, right? And so there's an intent in using the carceral state as a mean of accumulation and furthering government production in that way. But also in my work in Skid Row, I see the ways in which the serial creation of containment and dispossession, which are main tools of whatever in urban space can be seen as carceral, in which homeless people experience that every day, and how they work to combat that through what would be considered mundane practices of reclaiming rights, right? But ultimately try to reshape the sort of fabric or the sort of foundations of property that underpin the carceral state. And so for me, I actually don't approach the conversation from the idea that I'm a planner, I'm a geographer, and I'm a Black person before any of that. And so I tried, what I push for is Black liberation and how over time, Black people have worked to reshape the urban core through various forms of resistance, through government means, planning organizations including, as well as rebellion, so.
Thank you so much for everyone's insights. I was just thinking about, the forms of carceral state and the idea that the criminalization of homelessness is such a clear example of the ways that planning logics and systems get entangled in that. I think, I don't remember the exact numbers, but the Safer Cities Initiative in LA Skid Row, just the amount of money and time that's spent on arresting folks who live in Skid Row for, misdemeanors like jaywalking, right? But then you have bench warrants and then you get arrested. And I mean, just the sort of the ways that you get entangled kind of in the larger carceral system through this. I think even some of the police, the LAPD was saying well, we're helping them by getting them into the system. So this kind of really absurd logic that is embedded in sort of our homelessness programs in many cities. I'd like to open up the second question, which was really what has changed in this current moment? I think since the horrific murders of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and of George Floyd in Minneapolis, I think there's been concerted attention on both Black Lives Matter as a movement, but also kind of thinking about sort of more radical changes. So I'd love to hear actually from Dejanay, if you want to start, kind of how can we really build upon the power and energy of folks who've already gone before us, but also kind of move it forward.
Yeah, I'll share that, this has been really great. I am beyond grateful for how these calls for defund and divestment have taken a national and international stage. And as someone who had been active in New York City with the Coalition to End Broken Windows, as well as other organizations to stop various forms of policing in and throughout New York City's Black and Brown neighborhoods, it really it's like great to see the fruits of my labor and that of many others, and thus this movement and making that happen over the last few decades, and yet being a part of that more recently for myself and seeing a swift change in the national discourse. So it's been really great. And yeah, that's how I think about this. I think about this as part of a movement and legacy. One that just didn't start like back in May, right? But that people have been developing for decades. And seeing how, like with Eric Garner back in New York, we fought for divestment campaign immediately. And at the same time we were fighting for that, various other organizations and the city were pushing for accountability and training through more surveillance through body cameras. But to see that at that time in New York, we reshaped the discourse by saying, no, we need to divest from police. And then to see 5 years later that as part of the conversation is being completely sort of decentered continuously now. And people are saying, no, again, divest, defund, abolish. And so that's been amazing to see just within the last 5 to 7 years in my engagement with police abolition work.
Other folks on kind of how we can take this current moment and what are some of the opportunities that are afforded to us now, even in the midst of this crisis?
I guess I can go next. Yeah, I mean, just to try to build a bit off of Deshanay's points. I mean, I think, so maybe a little bit of context about the study that you mentioned, Annie. So I did, the survey of planning directors to try to understand whether they were engaging with these issues, and if so, how. I was not expecting to like find much, and did not. And so it was, although I did not frame it as a confirmatory study, it sort of was confirming a hunch that I had, right? That at least planning institutions, public institutions were not taking these issues on or seeing themselves as implicated in both the problems and the solutions of decarceration. So I would hope, and this was research that was conducted a few years ago and just came out. So I think, there's been a lot of like push in the interim, but this present moment, I would say that I would hope that this becomes that it is becoming a moment for folks who are finding themselves working, particularly like within this bureaucratic administrative kind of planning state that I'm describing, to start to get real with themselves. I should say with ourselves, right? Because I was part of that, as a regional planner for several years, but get real with ourselves about how we really are, how our actions and inactions perpetuate these problems. And then to Deshanay's point, I mean, I think, yes, with particularly like the moment of the defund divestment, and all of the possibility that opens up, combining that with the movements toward like participatory budgeting and different things that can start to reimagine and reappropriate and redistribute resources in ways that center, folks who in this instance have been, who have been wrapped up in the criminal justice system in one way or another, I think is extremely exciting. And I would hope that all of that coming together would give, those of us who often get into planning for like the right reasons, but then find themselves incredibly disempowered by a system that doesn't allow for radical like push to maybe, make stronger demands, force their institutions to reckon with the reality of like, we are part of this, very much a part of the problem and perhaps a part of the solution. But I believe that, and what my research showed at least is that although planners do have a lot of knowledge about how systems of exclusion and inclusion kind of get enacted in the environment, they're not necessarily like putting that together with the decarceration, kind of abolition. I wouldn't go as far as abolition, decarceration, kind of movement. And so it's just to say, there's a lot more work that can be done, and I'm excited and feeling very hopeful about this moment. But I think that it's going to take a lot of brave souls, like speaking truth to power, and I feel encouraged by my students every day that they're going to be entering these places and doing that. But I think it takes, not only newcomers, but also people at the top. And so I hope that this is a moment that we can all seize.
I just wanted to bring in, Silky. You wanna... No, go ahead.
Yeah, it was interesting to like negotiate the sort of rallying cry around free them all prior to the uprisings happening, and sort of just this moment of, hey, wait, there's all these people in these situations where they're susceptible to this like global pandemic that's happening, and why are we doing this? And so again, like maybe people weren't fully in the abolition space, but there was a little bit of like, hey, maybe pretrial detention, what, like there's all like so many people who are in pretrial detention, why do we even do that in the first place? And I think that was like that, and then the sort of like 1-2 punch of like, okay, actually a bunch of white people are now just reckoning with stuff in this way that's just, I don't know, as somebody who like similarly, my sort of introduction to, choosing to be an abolitionist, choosing to sort of go down this route, and was being at the 2003 Critical Resistance Conference in New Orleans and having just like a real perspective on, okay, wait, this is my calling, I want to do this, and then sort of ended up in the immigrant rights movement in the US, which is a very, it's not a racial justice movement in a lot of ways. It's very much a movement that was there to like pass a bill to get legalization and, not even really have a conversation about the border, and legalization in the context of a lot more enforcement, a lot more detention and deportation and militarization of the border. And so I think there's this reckoning that's been happening for some time, but you have this sort of world of, white women caring about kids in cages, and, or even recently with the really horrifying stories about forced gynecological procedures out of the Irwin Detention Center in Georgia, and some forced hysterectomies, like these sort of extreme situations where everyone's like, this is just so bad and we need investigations, or these specific things shouldn't happen, but not fully getting to this question that Courtney was talking about before, which is that's the sort of like banality of evil piece, which is like, like this system just exists and it exists to do these things, and we're not going to be worked up about that. So I don't know. I think it was an interesting moment to push the movement and say, hey, like defunding the police. We have a big campaign called Defund Hate that's trying to get money away from ICE and CBP. And so you could make these connections more, which was really exciting. There's so much more work to do. It's really hard to both be in this. I mean, as somebody who's been an abolitionist for a long time, I was inspired every day, and then also like in the moment feeling very sad about the grim possibilities of the world. But I do think, one story is when I started this job in the first year of the Obama administration in 2009, and people were just like, no, we can't end mandatory detention. That's too hard to do. We can't end these policies. And now we have like mainstream folks within the immigrant rights movement who are actually saying, okay, phase out detention, eliminate this thing. It doesn't make sense. We can't like make this better. And that's, something we've really pushed for. And I think so much of what's happening around the movement for Black lives is a huge part of that, and that call. So I'll offer that.
I'll just piggyback on that because I think it's I think I like Silky, I think I agree with you where I felt definitely like a lot of back and forth over the past couple of months. I think on the one hand, it is so amazing to see sort of the fruits of the labor and the love that people have put in to this idea of divesting and defending and abolition, right? And seeing that, like just seeing that in literally in the streets, right? Seeing, like you're saying, like nice white ladies in the suburbs, talking about these things, like for real, it's that there's something really powerful about that. But I think the other point that, that you both make is that, that's 10 plus years of organizing, and there's there's 10 plus years of organizing before that. And so I think, one of the things about this moment is really figuring out how to make it not a moment, right? That idea of turning a moment into a movement is really important. And I think also, Silky, the thing that is really amazing about your work and why I'm so glad that you're on this call is also that idea of making those connections. Because I think that, especially for folks that are just coming into this new, I think it's a little bit harder sometimes to make those connections. So thinking about the idea of the movement for Black lives, also, being connected to systems of immigrant detention, being so connected to, settler colonialism, like this idea of connecting the dots, I think is really important. And I think particularly for planners, that's, connecting those dots, I think will help, do some of what Courtney was mentioning, that idea of then connecting it to your own work. So yeah, I agree with you in that funny back and forth feeling.
I just wanted to insert a question from Jonathan, who asked that public sector planners are actually often so entangled up with police, like whether that's code inspections, going to community meetings, town halls. So how can you, is there a way to sort of disentangle this, again, the mundane sort of, well, of course, at the neighborhood council, the police come and report on what crimes have happened in the last month, or, of course, code inspectors come with a, cop. Is there kind of any suggestions, or just sort of throwing it out there for, yes, this is super hard. But yeah, I think, on the kind of on the ground, right? How do you work on abolition when the system is so all about policing as just the tool, right? I mean, that's, I think, even how planning is defined, right? Police powers.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. I mean, if I could start, if this is Jonathan Bell, I think I'll kick it right back to you, Jonathan. I think that your embedded planning framework is or like the embedded practitioner is a great place to start. So and then without your own story, I don't need to reiterate it, but this notion that you could be a code enforcement planner and push back against as much of that system from within your positionality within that bureaucracy as possible, that you could demand to step away from your desk and embed yourself within communities, so you can form relationships with people who you may even, and I'm just throwing this right back to you because I know your story, but that you may ultimately have to enforce something really terrible that, around, say whatever it might be, that you have to come down on that other side, but that there is something that happens that's really important, I think, in terms of the relationships that are built, and also the ways in which you yourself transform as an individual and as a practitioner when you step out on that limb and you push back, even when you encounter, naysaying, and that I think that's where you start. So I think you have the beginnings, or you have the seed of the answer in the work and in what you're already describing. And then it's just a matter of how far do we take that? I really feel like the possibilities are great. And if we could build a critical mass of people who are doing just that, embedding themselves within the communities that we're planning with, and really try to speak truth to power as much as we can, and offer alternatives, then that's at least a place to start. And I would hope that I mean, I don't know. I'm not like, I don't want to like paint it through rose-colored glasses. I'm not super optimistic about like the possibilities of the state, but I do think that it comes down to like individuals enforcing or pushing back against their own limitations within the bureaucracy. And when we build out, you know, a critical mass of people who are willing to seriously push back, then we don't know yet, because we haven't really, I mean, maybe haven't seen that, at least in our current generation, at least from what I can tell from a kind of a, you know, that activist, planner, insider, outsider position. So that's what I would offer to that question. Thank you.
I guess one thing, and I'm going to put the link in the chat, that I've been really inspired by is the work of the Tokening folks around mobility justice. And this came out, I guess, in April. And one of their kinds of, I guess, demands is that, you know, define street safety in a way that centers the most oppressed and vulnerable groups. Policing is not a tool for healing our divided communities, and official street closures usually involve police. These are not a solution for equitable street safety in communities of color. So just, you know, when we talk about open streets and yay, we need to have more public spaces, but if sort of embedded in the bad way, right? Like sort of entangled in that is the assumption that police will be enforcing that, right? That, you know, whatever new public health regulations we have are going to be enforced by police. I think the work that people have done, you know, on delivery workers and justice, mobility justice in New York, right? And the number of folks who get ticketed for not riding, you know, for being out or, you know, not riding with a mask or what have you. So I think those things were always just poking at our, oh, this is a great project. Wait, how does this involve police, right? Or how does this involve the criminal justice system, or, you know, involve categorizing someone as illegal or out of place, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Police, and then even, oh, sorry, go ahead,
No,
Sheryl-Ann.
go ahead.
I was going to say is like police and like citizens groups that consider themselves like accessories to that. So again, going back to that study, like, so I found that at least in my sample, there was virtually no engagement with like incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, their families, or their like immediate support service groups. But there was a whole lot of engagement with the police and with criminal watch, neighborhood watch groups, right? So, I mean, I think there's like that layer of it. And then there's also people who have like, in this vigilante sense, taken up this like notion that they're enforcing some standard. I'll stop there. Sheryl-Ann, sorry to cut you off.
No, you said exactly what I was going to say, only with data. So that was even better. Because I think, you know, having not worked in public planning, my professional work being in community development, I think, you know, again, it's this, you know, not just divesting our funds, but also divesting our attachments and divesting our imaginations. And so that idea that that a police officer always has to come and report to the community meeting, there's probably no law that says that actually has to happen, right? It's probably a practice or a habit that we've gotten into. So who are the people that are actually engaging with safety in the community that you could bring into that community meeting instead of a police officer? You know, and in community, you know, in community development work, we see this a lot as well, because engaging with the police is a way of validating our work sometimes, right? Because it's a connection to the state, and a connection to the state makes our work more valid. So again, it's this idea of, you know, really, you know, divesting our imagination and divesting our attachments as well, not just divesting our funding.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, a lot of work that's been both theorized and experimented in thinking about the public is often going back to this kind of conversation around capitalism and colonialism. Like, not a lot of people have access to public space simply because they are working, right? Simply because, and then when they are in it, right, they're either more criminalized, or if they don't have access to public space, or if they do have access to public space, right, you can be more criminalized for who you are in that space, or not having the means to engage in public space, which is highly commercialized and privatized, right? And has been over the last couple of decades due to redevelopment and gentrification. So part of organizing work that I engaged in back in 2013, as early as 2013, was to think about safety beyond policing and ultimately think about how do we work to make communities more whole, right? How do we work to reimagine and reproduce our communities as a space where it is livable, right? And without police, right? And that people have their needs. And so as much as we talk about this question around safety and how do we get police out of public space, I think there's a question, again, going back to this about what abolition is about, abolishing the conditions, right, that make the police and or carceral state what it is today. So it means, and this is something that I've tried to push even at, what's that conference? The Left Forum back a long time ago. I was on the panel with Tom Ngozi, Sam Stein, and Rob Robinson about talking about, and I was sharing on that panel that we can't de-link a conversation about housing from policing, right? And so if you can't de-link a conversation about affordable housing from policing, because so much of the problem with both is like not having access to one, and then also when you do have access, right? And if you are still poor or working class, right, your access to housing is continuously punitive and policed, right? And so there was a link put up to $1 Million Hoods, which is amazing, right? But it's birthed out of this concept of Eddie Ellis, right, that talked about $1 Million blocks on the East Coast, right? And thinking about how we can, again, divest and reinvest into actually making communities whole. And so, again, this conversation about the public, like, again, we're holding on to things that maybe we can do without. I mean, I love parks too. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, like, what is the investment in the planning idea of the public space, right? And ultimately, how can we be invested in just like, you know, making communities whole, right? So I'm currently Zooming in from Compton, California, because it's very hot in my apartment in Long Beach. So I'm at my grandmother's, right? But I see a switch or a swift change in policing just being in Compton, and the infrastructure here on the streets, potholes all throughout my grandmother's road, right? So that's public space, and yet where's the investment, right? So it's really about making communities whole.
Just to echo what you were saying, I am sharing the critical resistance definition of abolition. I know they have many, but this is one that has stuck out for me, which is abolition isn't just about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It is also about undoing the society we live in, because the prison industrial complex both feeds on and maintains oppression and inequalities through punishment, violence, and controlling millions. And you know, the point about affordable housing is part of this conversation around abolition, right? That, you know, if people are being criminalized and arrested for being homeless, right, for sitting in a public sidewalk, then 100% housing needs to be part of that conversation. I know this is a time where I said we would open it up to audience questions. So I think we've gotten a few, and, you know, I'm happy to keep on sharing my prompts. I think I'll throw it out there while the folks in the audience think about what they want to ask. And this is really just, I think, kind of to share where our roots are, or kind of the origin story. I think was a 2003 Critical Resistance Conference for Silky, but maybe kind of how have you been, how did you get here in this, you know, like what shaped your thinking? You know, is there a person or a scholar, or, you know, was there an experience that really pushed you to embrace abolition, or at least start on that path towards embracing abolition?
I'll share. it was for me, it was back in my undergrad at Cal State Northridge, where Debbie Burton and Becky Dennison visited my social work class and talked about the policing that they were experiencing in Skid Row. And I was studying gentrification at the time and was going to enter into graduate school and have been very activated by Occupy within that same time. And so going into graduate school, I took the onus into learning and wanting to come back home to LA. And so I took a focus on Skid Row as a course of dissertation research. And from there, from the Los Angeles Community Action Network, who I worked with, taught me a great deal about police abolition and taught me a great deal about the stakes of their organizing and their fight, and pushed me both as a Black person and as a scholar and as an activist to connect with people in New York and keep that fight going. And that ushered me into a lot of activism I was doing with the Coalition to End Broken Windows and many other organizations like Stop the Raids Coalition, to stop policing practices, to call things out and to fight, right? To have that hard fight. So that's what inspires me. And I just so happened to have been going to CUNY, and I did not know Ruth Wilson Gilmore before I went to grad school. But I soon did after. And so just being able to be in New York and learn from people has been amazing as well. So that's been sort of how I've been on this, and it's been great and also very much so disappointing at times, but I think that we're in a good space. So.
Sheryl-Ann or Courtney?
I can just go quickly. I think, yeah, this is what it's. I think for me, it's mostly been through service. So, working with organizations that are run by people who have been the most impacted by these systems, and working with those organizations in service. And that's everything from, working in service as, just some random kid in their 20s to working in service in terms of using my position as a university professor to offer the labor of my students to organizations that are doing this work, right? In a reciprocal relationship, right? Where the organizations are supported by the resources of the university, and the students, are hopefully also going to be going to learn something from that process of service to the organization. So for example, when I taught at University of California, Davis, I worked with fathers and families of San Joaquin County, which is an amazing organization, and had, a couple of groups of students work with them. And, universities are incredibly well-resourced institutions in a lot of ways, even though we sort of cry poor compared to the organizations that are doing this work on the ground. So if I can lend the resources of the university to those organizations in service, that's another way that I can hopefully continue this.
Sure. I mean, very briefly, I think I had my trajectory was sort of from an academic perspective. For a long time, I had been kind of thinking about these topics and studying them, but it really became personal for me when I was living in Chattanooga, Tennessee. This was back in 2012. I was working on my dissertation as part of that, which it involved a participatory action research project with a community-based group there called Chattanooga Organized for Action. One of the things that we did was organize a planning free school out of the public library. And as part of that, we had these issue-based discussion groups. And so we were convening these conversations around employment and workforce development. It was the whole idea was just come if you want to have a conversation about this and you feel dissatisfied by the kind of the public processes that have been offered in the city up until now. If you want to center justice, to come to the space. And there was not really a big agenda beyond that. There was a gentleman who showed up a few times and didn't say much. And then finally one day he just piped up and he said, I've been sitting here. I came because I'm interested in these conversations. I spent time in a, you know, I forget if it was a state or federal prison, but essentially, like, since I've been released and I'm back in my community now and I've paid my dues, and I not only is it like really difficult for me to find work and to access opportunity structures, but two, he said this is like a paraphrase, but more or less a direct quote. This is the first time in my life that anyone is asking me about what I want for my city and what is my vision for the city. And it was like, this was just me and like a few other people doing this little ragtag thing off on the side in the public library. And it just, I mean, it was like my oh shit moment of how I like understood this from an academic perspective and not put the two and two together up until this moment. And so that really inspired me to take these issues on much more seriously. And I think it manifests itself through like some of that research that we described. It also, to Sheryl-Ann's point, being in New York at Pratt now for about a year, we've been collaborating with New York City Probation's Neon Centers and trying to, which are these, they call themselves sort of like experimental community centers that try to, and they're doing good things, but they're also not like perfect, but they are trying to like critically examine the role of like probation in communities, and what is the role of a probation agency? How do we destigmatize the client, probation client community relationship? How do we try to start to address some of the root causes in community that are these structures that produce these conditions, environments that we're talking about? And so I find that work really interesting, and I think there are lots of other places to go from there, but that was the thing that kind of committed me to the work, was meeting this gentleman and hearing him say that to me. It was truly a rude awakening.
Several great questions from participants, and I just wanted to read out two that I think are related in some ways. So one anonymous person asked sort of whether or not car-oriented development has been a contributing factor to what can we call carceral planning, or police state planning. And then Connor asked, for us to expand on how folks are criminalized in public space, and especially thinking about how transportation spaces, subways, cars, sidewalks, buses have become, I guess, also kind of surveillance spaces, loitering as a crime, all of these different ways that we've, in some ways, and I think I used maybe Nick Blomley's idea around how we think of space as just for transportation or for walking, and that we don't acknowledge that there's other uses, like maybe just resting or even sleeping. So just, I know it's a two-part question that I created out of single-part questions, but does anyone want to take tackle either part?
Yeah, I'll share that. One of the ways that it's really connected is that a lot of policing policies and ideas are predicated on the need to sort of make certain public spaces function right in relationship to commercialization or privatization. And so a lot of our fights earlier in New York were fighting around the constant, around stop and frisk, fighting around broken windows policing, both in LA as well, but in New York. And most of those things were about trying to stop the police from ticketing people at the subway turnstile, stopping police from policing, criminalizing, locking up people, street performers, subway performers. Even in Skid Row, Pete White likes to explain this as an example of just how punitive the policing was there, but that a resident, right, someone walking in and amongst Skid Row would be given a citation for the ashes of a cigarette, right, being, dumped on the sidewalk, just the ashes of a cigarette, right? So these broken windows, stop and frisk, these like kinds of policing practices that criminalize just being, right? Just being in space, right? Because you don't have certain access to certain things that make you a capitalist citizen, right? Is part of, right? A perfect capitalist citizen is part of what those connections are, right? And so yes, thanks for sending that. So those are the connections that I've seen throughout my work in the ways that we've just tried to decriminalize this, even, during my time in LA, in New York, and I highly suggest I forget the name, but I was going to suggest you follow someone so I can sit it on the thread. But there are many efforts to make, right, New York City Metro and public transportation completely free, right? There are all these endeavors to make these things free because the fact that they cost, right, leads to all of the criminalization and policing, right? Making housing affordable and or free, right? Basic human rights can lead to reducing, eliminating, right, these penal or punitive forms of urban governance. And so that's the way I've seen it, both in terms of organizing and in research or theorizing.
And just to chime in on the sort of like immigration piece here, I mean, it's really like, so many spaces of movement are places where people are targeted for immigration, Greyhound, Amtrak, ports of entry, et cetera, like all these different places. That's though I will say, I mean, and this is a little bit more true during the Obama administration, the way that people are mostly funneled in is through the criminal justice system. And so when you think, so you do have this piece where people are being targeted, on buses or trains or et cetera. But then you also just have this whole infrastructure that's created where police become ICE enforcers, they're immigration enforcers through programs like 287G, that sort of gives them that authority. And then you have all these other, it sort of creates this incentive, right? So all of this is about this sort of like incentivizing. It's like, well, I'm going to stop this person because they have a broken tail light or whatever is happening. But because I'm an immigration enforcer, now I'm going to target them for that as well. And so it adds just this whole other layer, right? You have policing as this sort of, idea of decorum or whatever we're talking, y'all will talk about it better than I can, but just in terms of this idea of like what policing does in the space that we're trying to create, but then the sort of incentives that are created whenever you add another layer of, who is rightfully in this country and who is rightfully not in this country. And now because I have that authority as an officer, I can, I'm just gonna, find reasons to sort of target people. And I think that it really just shows how much that intersection is about, like, again, this like deep racism, racial capitalism, exclusion, et cetera, like all those pieces are there. It's not, when you think about immigration, obviously it shouldn't be about, and any of these things shouldn't be about these things, but it's like, it just becomes that because you're embedding it in the infrastructure of the criminal punishment system and policing.
Right, and just to add, I just wanted to mention that going back to making public transportation free, was that one of the ways that people tried to organize and make this a point back in New York was to amplify this sort of New Yorker ethos of swiping it forward, right? Letting someone in, which were practices that people always did, right? But that people started creating this larger movement on the subways to call attention to this. And I would highly suggest following the organization Why Accountability, who's been leading this effort, and also the Swipe It Forward campaign. But just to go back to this part about immigration and also this sort of piece around discretion, identification, criminalization, like there are so many tools that police use, racist ideas that they use to then target and say, and I think that's an immigrant, or I think that person is criminal, by way of someone looks, right? The skin tone, what kind of things that they wear, like what kind of clothing that people wear. Even in NYCHA housing, we saw how, you know, just markers of being someone, you know, being in that area, wearing Jordans, wearing certain fitted caps, things could automatically put you on a gang database, because the police are seeing you, recording you as whatever they want to record you as, a gang member or whatever, using that kind of surveillance and discretion to then further use that to lock people up or have these raids in NYCHA housing. So there are just a lot of tools, right, that they have, right? And so that's why getting them out of neighborhoods, getting them, the police out of the streets, right? Out of the ability to just park your car on the asphalt, right? And surveil, like getting police presence out of neighborhoods is really important. That's why it is.
I think just quickly, I think the question of transportation is really important, in part because like it's a comfortable planning question. So it's like it's a good spot for us to talk about, because I think a lot of planners are like, oh, that's something I understand. It's something I feel comfortable with. And it's a place where planners, you know, have some leverage and control. And I think to the point that folks have made, you know, in a city like Sacramento, if you look at youth that are sort of piped into the system, right? A lot of youth get piped into the system because they get tickets for not paying their fares, getting on the frankly not great public transportation system in Sacramento. So again, like it becomes a way that you're then put into this larger system, right? It's through your inability to pay for a service that should be, or that is claimed to be, a public service. So it goes back again, thinking about sort of radical planning, right? It goes back again to this system of, you know, what we've chosen to privatize, what we've chosen to publicize, you know. And so police are, you know, if they're in the public and it's a service that is readily available in certain neighborhoods, and in those same neighborhoods, you know, you don't have access to the services that are actually going to, as Deshonay said, make communities whole. So again, right, thinking about what we make public and what we make private, transportation is a great link to that. And someone in the chat mentioned sort of the role of women, and that's like another spot where what we make public and what we make private is really important. You know, especially in communities where there's a huge disparity in terms of who is locked up, you see that women are often the folks that are, you know, taking their kids to these prisons that are way intentionally designed to be isolated from their own communities. And again, right, the privatization of transportation, right, not as a public good, but as a, you know, private investment, means that it's that much more difficult for women to do that work of, you know, of keeping their kids engaged with their fathers, of caring for folks that are incarcerated. So again, right, what do we choose to invest in publicly, and what do we choose to privatize? And, you know, we choose to invest in surveillance, we choose to invest in banishment, and we choose to privatize care. So.
We have, a bunch of questions that are kind of the big, you know, billion-dollar questions. And, you know, can you do this as a planner, right? As a public planner, or is this something that you have to do kind of as a community advocate or as a volunteer, right? Is there even a space for kind of decarceral or abolition planning within current government systems? I think, you know, someone else had a question on, you know, what do we actually have to do to confront kind of carceral planning, and what are these barriers that we're going to be facing? I think another person, Tessa, in the chat, you know, was like, is there kind of an action plan, right, for, you know, how to, you know, look at planning through an abolition lens, like how to, you know, I don't know, like a checklist or some set of questions that you could at least start to ask, you know, oh, this general plan, is this a carceral planning example, or is this something that we can kind of reimagine, right, to be a different understanding of the system? And then there was, these are all the massive questions. What is a system of care? How would we do that, right? How do we plan thinking about systems of care, funding systems of care, imagining, attaching ourselves to ideals of systems of care? You know, what would true, genuine safety look like? So these are, I think, really like the $1 trillion questions of, okay, we know we need to do this, but can we imagine it, right? And then sort of in the short term, what can we do even incrementally, I think, to get there that isn't the reformist reform, right? Where you put more money into police body cams, where you decide that the solution to racial bias is, algorithms that are supposedly unracist. So that's a lot, but I think the long-term, kind of the long-term vision, but also the short-term, this is an action we can take now.
I'll go again, unless anyone else wants to go. These are all great questions. They're perfect. I'll just share a few things. So a couple years ago, UCLA Urban Planning wrote a piece about abolitionist planning, right? And I think they're one of the first to think through and coin this idea abolition planning or abolitionist planning. And I would check that out. Because a lot of it was pushing for how can we rethink urban planning as a field? How can we take on these calls of sanctuary or of Black Lives Matter? And so it's a really important first step. I tried to uplift that work and also add to it in a piece that I wrote for Progressive City. And I'll share some of what I shared there. Is that we have to start thinking outside of our professions. I consider the work of abolition my life's work, right? Because abolition is part of Black liberation. I'm always going to be fighting for that as a Black person. And so as much as it's about thinking about how to do this within planning, I think what's really important is to think about your role as a person, a human being, and or organizer, and how you do and fight for abolition. And then I think also, right, thinking about within that, thinking about how you can both experiment both inside and outside of planning is really key there. And in that piece that I wrote, I suggested reading Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy, because I feel like it gives a sense of hope and also some skill sets for you to think through your role in shaping change, right? And that's based off of, Octavia Butler here, based off of some of her conceptualizations around how we can shape change in mode space. And so I think that's really important. And in addition to that, I was on a panel, I think it was back in July, hosted by Stop LAPD Spying. Highly suggest you check them out. They're doing amazing work around surveillance, great friends and comrades of mine. So highly suggest you look at their work. And on that panel, the co-panelist was part of Critical Resistance based out of Oakland and then in Philly. And one of the things that she shared was how critical resistance has these like forming questions that they ask themselves when they're doing campaign or organizing work. And they both ask themselves these questions before they do certain campaigns and also after them. And so I'll kind of restate my paraphrase of it, but one of the things that they ask themselves is how has the work cut or chopped away from the prison industrial complex in its presence in community and or in policy. And so I just thought that was, and they have more, it's more robust. So I would just Google it if you can find it. But if you can orient yourself around a set of principles, practices, and our questions in the work that you do, I highly suggest adopting some of what they have employed, because I think that's what makes this work strong, is as much as everyone can operate in principle, then we will be getting closer to this larger vision. And so as much as you can ask yourself those similar questions and be principled in that way in both in your profession and also in the streets, right? I think it's really key. So yeah.
I think just to I'll maybe just to pivot a little bit to the sort of systems of care, and I think to jump off what you were just talking about, I think, you know, for anybody who, let's say, comes from a middle class background, from anybody that comes from a suburban background, you know, if you're trying to envision these systems of care, they already exist, right? There aren't police constantly surveying the suburbs. You know, there aren't police constantly surveying upper income communities, but those communities are safe. And so what makes those communities safe, right? Stable housing, right? Knowing that you're going to have a place that you can go home to and you can afford makes, you know, creates safety. You know, knowing that you're going to be able to express yourself culturally, right? That you're going to be able to engage with your family, with your community, makes you feel more safe, right? That's another kind of aspect of safety. Knowing that you're going to have something to do with your day, right? So that's, you know, quote unquote, going to work, but more importantly, being able to be involved and engaged productively, you know, in the broader society, right? That's something that makes you feel safe. So those are, you know, those are actually all the things that make us feel safe, right? So what are the things in planning that support that, right? Affordable housing supports that. You know, we're talking about transportation, you know, transportation supports that. Thinking about public space in terms of how people want to use them to build community, to build solidarity, to build identity, not just to be sold something, right? That creates safety. And so again, like a lot of the bread and butter things that planners are supposed to do, if we take a proper equity lens and really think about who has access to those things and who doesn't have access to those things, we're kind of already putting ourselves, you know, on a step towards this kind of abolitionist planning. But the other part of it is also, again, like thinking about who we're in service to in our planning. And a lot of times we're in service to growth. We're in service to, you know, both growth in terms of kind of just the city has to always be growing in terms of population, but also the city as growth machine narrative that we're, you know, a lot of us are familiar with. So again, if we're thinking about these systems of care, I was on a panel with Zoe Todd, who's this amazing scholar, and she came up with this, you know, talking about the idea of the city not as a growth machine, but the city as a care machine. So what if we filtered instead of filtering through that lens of growth, right? What if we had to filter all of our zoning, all of our budgetary, all of our, you know, transportation planning, all of our land use planning, if we had to filter that through a lens of care instead of a lens of growth, what would happen?
Yeah, and I would just add on this in the context of immigration. So it's always tough because I think we're negotiating this like federal policy and how it sort of trickles down to what's happening in communities and then how communities are choosing to respond to that. But I think that that imagining is sort of like the big key piece here. One of the things that you know, in this context where like there's so much acceptance of the nation state and borders and all these other pieces, like it's just like people really struggle with these concepts. And so it's like how, when I think about the journey of the conversation around abolition from, you know, 25 years ago when critical resistance started to, you know, in the 70s when people, you know, like however long we've been having this conversation, and how much it's shifted over the years. Like I want to think about that a lot in terms of the context of immigration and how we think about borders. And it's hard because it's so polarized and politicized in this way, and it shuts down conversations really early on. And I seeing the movement that we've seen, I'm like, okay, I know at some day we're going to get there. And I have to believe that to keep going. But I think the way that I've been talking about it a little bit with folks who are maybe in, you know, because I'm in this weird space where I both am managing this coalition calling for abolition and then also having to have conversations with people making policy in DC, really thinking about what does it look like for us to have an immigration system that thinks about protection and care as opposed to you know, exclusion, enforcement, militarization, all the things that are there. And so I feel like that's one of the pieces. And then one of the things that we're doing, and now I'm realizing maybe I should talk to some planners to see if they want to support us on this, but with our Defund Hate campaign, we've been, you know, we work with all these local groups across the country, and some of them we're asking them to work with their communities to do invest surveys. So divest, invest surveys. So like, you know, well, what are the things that you would want to invest in if you know, or not if, like, what are the things that are not working in your community right now? And it's interesting to have this conversation because I think we're just trying to get at that core of like, what do people need, and what can we talk about in terms of investment, instead of, you know, the sort of like, well, defund hate, it doesn't, it's like, what are we imagining, you know? And I think that's going to be key. So I might tap some of y'all for that.
I guess, thank you, everyone. I guess the thing I would add to this piece of the conversation is, I'm sort of imagining, you know, what might I say to, like, you know, the public sector planner who's asking, okay, I have this, like, you know, understanding of the problem, and so where do I begin? I mean, I totally agree with everything that's been said before. We need to be pushing with all of our might to be moving toward this, you know, kind of culture and system of care. For me, it's like going back to my original point of the banality of the ways in which these things get enacted. I mean, if I were a public sector planner who was trying to seriously think about how do I grapple with this, or not just like grapple with it. I don't mean like reckon in just this like empty term, but like really get a clear stock of like, how am I as an individual within this organization, and how is this institution, you know, tied up in these processes? I mean, I think what at least the study that I've been referencing illuminated for me was that although the directors and the planners who I interviewed had, you know, a kind of a good sense of these are the zoning, you know, regulations and opportunities that would allow for the kinds of infrastructure of care that we're talking about, they didn't necessarily translate into an understanding of like, do these things exist on the ground? Who are the actors who are involved? And certainly didn't translate to like the level of, are we engaging these folks? So, you know, it suggested a very one-sided view of how we engage in the carceral state, and it was the punitive side of that, right? And so, I mean, I think for me, like the one suggestion I would make is just stopping and taking a real like stock and inventory of, okay, what does our, you know, we want to start with zoning. What does our zoning code allow for? What does it prohibit? Then like where, like, how does that translate onto the ground, and who, you know, is, who are the institutions, not only the institutions, but particularly like the community-based organizations and the activists who are pushing for these things, and how do we figure out ways to connect with them, to build relationships with them, to meaningfully engage them so that it's not, you know, at best an afterthought, and at worst just like non-existent. I mean, I think we need to really look inward and get a sense for how our mostly unintentional, inadvertent practices, you know, and the things that we sort of uphold and promote as like rules, how they create these barriers in these systems. And then so once we, as planners, public sector planners, once we have a sense for how we're in a very concrete way, like perpetuating these systems and part of the problem, then I think, and if we figure out ways to really change the way that we're engaging people and who we're engaging and how and in what terms and like what that turns into, then I think that the answers are already there in the struggles and like the demands that have already been articulated. And so it's a matter of bringing those into the fold and taking them seriously, and not just engaging and then putting it into an appendix at the end of a study, but really like centering that space. So, I mean, I think there's just a ton of work to do, but just because it is like overwhelming doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to like put our finger on one part of it and start to disentangle it and go from there.
So obviously this has been a fantastic conversation, and we've even extended it to 9:30 Eastern. So we're down to our last few minutes. And the question that I kind of had left was really kind of any suggestions, advice, knowledge to impart to students, in particular planning students. on kind of how they might get involved. I think especially in a collective fashion, right? I think oftentimes when we want to get activated, we think about individual action. I will vote, but I'm sick of hearing that as like the one thing I need to be doing this year. And then I think, you know, to not just limit it to students, and then we might have to just share this as resources later. But I really kind of like my heart felt, I think what Deshonay was saying around as a person in the world, right? We may not find a place to do this in our, you know, work at City Hall at the public counter, right? But we can nonetheless do this work kind of as a person in the world, whether that's, you know, in the resident, you know, in the communities that we live in, or, you know, in sort of this imaginative way of, you know, thinking about a big picture. So any suggestions, advice for students?
I'll say quickly, like, so much of our work is negotiating really mundane zoning and trying to stop new facilities from coming in or get facilities closed. And like having people with expertise is huge. Like there's in the work that we do here in Seattle, Tacoma, there's like multiple geographers who are just like there negotiating the Tacoma City Council constantly and figuring out like how we're gonna get this, you know, resolution passed or the zoning code or whatever, all the things. And so I'll just say like, any help to offer folks around either getting facilities shut down or stopping new facilities, I think is a really concrete and great way to engage at the local level.
I'll just say quickly for students, I think one thing that's really that I think you forget sometimes when you're a student is that you actually have a huge amount of power in the institution and the department. And so I always look at something like food planning, right? And food planning totally came out of students. It came out of students showing up and saying, why aren't you teaching us about food systems? And all of a sudden it became something that every planning department had to have. So, you know, if students are showing up and they're saying, why aren't you teaching us about immigration planning? Why aren't you teaching us about the relationship between planning and carceral states? You would be surprised how all of a sudden that's going to be something that all schools have to have. So especially for folks that are at elite schools, you know, you kind of set these weird trends and you actually have quite a bit of power. So showing up and asking, why aren't you teaching us about this, can be just one action that actually can have a pretty huge ripple effect.
Maybe I could build off of that. You know, Sheryl-Ann, you kind of stole the words out of my mouth, but what I was going to, it's okay. What I was going to say was this question made me think of our common professor, the late, great Susan Christopherson, and we were sitting together in like a planning theory course together. And I remember her, or no, maybe it was orientation, whatever it was, but she said, you're going to be here for like the next few years. This, just so you know, like you might not realize it yet, but this period where you're a student is going to afford you some of the most, like maybe the period of the most intellectual and like creative freedom that you might ever have in your life. So this is the time to like push the envelope. And I remember her like blowing up, you know, our planning theory course and being like, I don't even know what planning theory is. You tell me. I mean, do you remember this? And like, that was the place where these ideas could really get like introduced and where the buck could get pushed. And I agree with you, Sheryl-Ann. I mean, I think, you know, we have another professor from graduate school who told me when she heard that I was starting to get involved in this stuff, oh, I had a graduate student 8 or 10 years ago who wanted to introduce these ideas. And at that time, I told him, nobody's dealing with these issues, right? And I've heard that too when I submitted this paper to another journal. They said, this is interesting and it's like well written, but planners can't like take on another issue. They can't take on this issue. It's too big and it's like outside of their scope. And I don't buy that, right? And I mean, I think that you have incredible, you know, power and intellectual creative freedom to put new issues on the table and to demand that the rest of us take you seriously and take those issues on. So don't be afraid to bring up things that maybe feel like they're outside of the scope of what we consider these realms, because that's how these things happen. It happened with the food systems planning and it's happening with this now.
We are at time and there are so many things that we could continue. This has been a fabulous conversation. I hope we can not only follow up, I think, with attendees by posting some stuff on progressivecity.net, but also maybe with the panelists and figuring out how to, you know, all right, this is how we can demand, a planning and policing class, right? Like these are and there's great syllabi available. I mean, I think there's a lot of resources, and part of it is just directing it to kind of a specific aim. So I don't have any like rousing final words, except thank you. And I do want to remind folks that this is a Planners Network event. So please, join us as a member or make a donation if you're a little commitment shy. And that, please, keep an eye out. We're, going to continue to try to kind of push this conversation, and really, abolition planning should be a thing, right? That this is something that we can make happen, even if our imaginations are still sort of struggling with it today. So I am happy to leave the room open. I'm going to say the formal part of our panel is finished, but I, was saying to the panelists before, I hate the fact that in Zoom events, we all just disappear. So, please ask things in chat. I'm happy to respond. I'm not sure if other folks need to get going. It's very late, but, at least for another 10 minutes, let's keep the space open. And then just, I forget, I think you can do, is it like jazz hands, or if Zoom allows like the thumbs up or the clap? I forget what the options are, but just to say thank you to our 4 panelists tonight. Thank you. I'll be the clapper.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for being here.
So yeah, I will awkwardly hang out for another 10 minutes. I'm not saying that people have to hang out, but just in case you have some follow-up questions. And then I think there has been several questions we didn't get to, so hopefully we can also follow up on those.
I don't know why I still don't unmute myself. Yeah, I guess if anybody like who's still around has a question that we didn't address and still wants to talk about it. I don't know if there's a way to like re-thing your question or like flag your question.
Willow had a question.
No.
And specifically the Breonna Taylor case, and thinking about both the slow violence in underinvestment, abandonment, but also, the actual, like, I guess, fast violence of police violence, which is, again, one of those big ones. But
yeah, it's such a good question. I wish we had like, I don't know if Willow's still on. If Willow's still on, she should raise her hand and like, she should tell us the answer, because I'm sure she has like a better answer than anyone else here. But I was thinking about it because I think one of the things that's interesting is this, when you think about all the different things that you have to divest from, I think also like divesting from police data, like just as like a data nerd, like feels really important, because so much of how our image of places that we don't, the places as planners, we're making decisions about places based on not personal knowledge or not the like local knowledge of the place, but based on these data sets, right? And thinking about why and how those data sets were collected, particularly with crime data, is so important, So I don't know. That's my like that was my like first lazy nerd thought about it. But I'm sure Willow had like a much like more like dense idea in this question.
I wanted to go back to this discussion. I'm not sure if Courtney wanted to answer that question too, but back to this discussion about the limits of doing abolitionist work in planning. And the reason why I push to thinking about it outside of your profession is because even back in 2014, 2015 with Eric Gardner and our push for this Safety Beyond Policing campaign, there were many people that were part of nonprofit organizations throughout New York City and people who worked for City Hall who were very dissatisfied with the way that the city was moving into this accountability and surveillance move, and took their hats off and like went and like organized with and in support of safety beyond policing, right? And they for that divestment campaign while in the work, and I would say prominent nonprofit organizations that you would think would be for abolitionist reform or, you know, or non-reformist reform, right? So this is just to say that, like, the way this the work happens and the way that you can do the work isn't necessarily cut and dry, that oftentimes we occupy certain positions and would compromise our own principles. And that's why I highly suggest reading someone like Adrienne Marie Brown and thinking about ways that you can experiment in that space, in the limited space of the nonprofit industrial complex, or for me in academia, right? And at the same time, still keep fighting and pushing for abolition and pushing for your principles, right? And so finding outlets for that. Often that means you're doing a lot of work, right? Obviously, you know, pace yourself, but that's just something important to highlight, that you don't, if making this your life work means moving in ways that you can see that happen. You can see the fruits of what you think is productive labor and productive change.
And I wonder if, like, for the folks that are still on,
we have, I guess, 23 people in addition to us.
Yeah.
22. So,
is Kista still on? Somebody asked about zoning in the, yeah, Kista's still here. Be interested in learning more about the need for people to understand zoning. I think you can unmute people. Maybe you can't. Maybe Norma would have to, but
yeah.
If people wanted to be unmute.
The webinar format, you can't, like,
This complaint grumbling about Zoom is not preserved for posterity. I think that piece around zoning clearly needs to be teased out, and I think in the intro that you and Justin wrote, maybe that's like a starting point. So Joyce asked for a list of writings and essays by folks on the panel, so we'll definitely compile that. And I think a lot of people may not have access to JPER because they're not at an institution, so we'll figure out a way to get them the PDFs.
I think, I don't know if it's still true, but for a while it's not. Okay,
yeah.
Never mind. I'll stop.
Yeah, it's not. I know there's like a magical, that was JPER's like act of solidarity.
Yes.
With like 6 weeks of open
Free
access.
downloads.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're still in the chat, if you wanted to give us maybe even a little bit, like one more sentence about what you were thinking about in terms of zoning, or what your thesis is about. Not to put you on the spot, but.
Questa's in my MA seminar, so I always have a chance to follow up with her. So, so maybe Questa and I can talk about it.
Oh, okay.
Cool. Oh, excellent. So yeah, I think maybe we can wrap it up here, but hopefully we really have a lot, I think, of resources to share, folks. And I think that we also drop things in the chat in terms of links to organizations, and I'm sure there's other organizations that we can think of right now, or thinkers. I was like making my list and like, who do I want to mention? It was Alicia Garza, Miriam Kaba, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, right? The Untokening Critical Resistance, some of whom actually came up obviously already, but there are a lot of other resources. So again, in the mini last version of the audience, thank you for sticking around, and really please reach out to us and reach out to Planners Network. It's kind of our commitment to continue to make these kinds of spaces available. If the traditional planning, I guess, arenas, whether that's practitioner or academia, are a little bit leery of abolition planning, we are not. So hopefully we can continue to make these spaces. And then again, thank you to all of you guys, to Silky, Sheryl-Ann, Courtney, and Deshonay. This has been fantastic. I am like all excited and jazzed up.
All right. We can keep this conversation going. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Sheryl-Ann.
Bye, Courtney.
See you soon.